December 21st, 2015. I was 20 years old, working part-time as a delivery driver to save up for college. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I enjoyed driving through the quiet countryside. That night, I had one last delivery, a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was about 15 miles off the main road, deep in the woods. The address wasn't even on GPS. My boss had scribbled directions on a scrap of paper. Snowflakes began falling as I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, and soon the trees on either side formed a dark, suffocating tunnel. I remember checking the time, 10:47 p.m. The delivery was already late, and I cursed myself for not leaving sooner. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of tires on snow. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and there was no smoke coming from the chimney. Still, I got out of the car, carrying the package. The air was bitterly cold, biting through my jacket as I made my way to the front door. I knocked 3 times. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. From inside, I heard faint footsteps, slow, deliberate. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Delivery," I called out. The footsteps stopped. The door creaked open, just a crack. I couldn't see anyone inside, just a sliver of darkness. I've got a package for you," I said, holding it out. The door opened wider, and that's when I saw him, a man, or what I thought was a man. He was tall and gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over his face. His eyes were sunken and lifeless, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice dry like leaves crunching underfoot. I handed him the package, my hands trembling. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. "Have a good night," I mumbled, turning to leave. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still standing in the doorway, watching me. I got in the car and started the engine, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. But as I drove down the dirt road, my headlights caught movement in the trees. A figure was standing among the shadows, watching me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The figure stepped closer, and I realized it was the same man. I floored the gas pedal, the car skidding on the icy road as I sped away. But no matter how fast I went, I kept seeing him, standing by the trees, on the side of the road, even in my rearview mirror. It was impossible. There was no way he could be keeping up with the car. Then, about a mile from the main road, the car died. The engine sputtered and went silent, the headlights flickering out. I was plunged into darkness, the silence of the forest pressing in around me. I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't budge. My phone had no signal, and the temperature was dropping fast. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, his face pressed against the glass, his smile wider than before. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my throat was raw when I woke up. It was morning, and the car was back on the main road. A state trooper was tapping on the window, asking if I was okay. When I told him what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "That cabin burned down 5 years ago," he said. "No one's lived there since." I quit my delivery job the next day. I don't drive through the woods anymore. And every year on December 21st, I stay far away from any roads that lead into the trees. Because I know he's still out there, waiting. My name is Thomas Grayson, and I've never been the kind of person to tell ghost stories. I don't believe in the supernatural or anything of that sort, at least, I didn't. That all changed one December night, a night I'll never forget, and one I don't speak of to anyone. It started like any other cold winter night. The snow was thick, the air biting, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold, silver light across the world. I was with a group of old friends, gathered at a remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. We'd been drinking, laughing, reminiscing about the old days, when one of us suggested we go for a walk. At first, the idea seemed harmless enough. We were all adults, and while the snowstorm outside had made the roads impassable, the woods around the cabin were still navigable. So, we bundled up and set out, our boots crunching in the deep snow. There were 5 of us: myself, Mark, Claire, Jason, and Ellie. As we walked deeper into the woods, the sound of our voices faded, swallowed by the heavy blanket of snow. The trees loomed above us, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow, and the world seemed quieter than it should have been. Then, we came to a clearing. It was small, circular, surrounded by thick trees, and in the center of the clearing stood a single, twisted tree. It wasn't like any tree I'd ever seen. Its bark was dark, almost black, and its branches stretched out in jagged angles, as though they had been gnarled and bent by something other than time. None of us spoke, but we all felt it, a tension in the air, like the world had suddenly shifted. It felt wrong, like the clearing itself had been waiting for us. Jason, who was always the most daring, stepped forward and reached out to touch the tree. The moment his hand made contact, a low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the earth itself was groaning. We all froze, our eyes wide with shock. Then the ground beneath our feet trembled. The snow around the base of the tree began to shift, as though something was moving beneath it. Slowly, the earth cracked open, and a figure began to rise from the ground. At first, it was hard to make out what it was. It was a dark shape, like a shadow with no clear form, but as it rose higher, it became unmistakable. A figure, tall and elongated, its body covered in dark, tattered robes. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a featureless, pale mask with 2 dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through us. None of us moved. We couldn't. We were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure floated above the ground, its presence pressing in on us like the weight of a storm. Then, it spoke. Its voice was a low, distorted whisper, but we all heard it clear as day. "You should not have come here." The words felt like a physical blow, reverberating through the air, rattling our bones. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to take a step back, but my body refused to obey. Suddenly, Ellie screamed. The sound broke the silence, and the figure seemed to shift, as though it had been disturbed from some ancient slumber. It moved toward her, its form distorting as it glided through the snow. We all ran. We didn't look back as we sprinted toward the cabin, our breaths coming in sharp gasps. The wind howled in our faces, and the snow whipped against our skin, but the only thing that mattered was getting away from whatever that thing was. We made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us, and for a long time, none of us spoke. We were all shaking, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had happened. But we all knew, that we had seen something that shouldn't have been. We never spoke of it again. Ellie left the next morning, and the rest of us stayed another day before quietly slipping away, one by one. No one ever mentioned that night again, but we all knew that something had followed us. That presence, whatever it was, had marked us, and every time I close my eyes at night, I feel it lurking in the dark, waiting. I haven't been back to those woods since. And I don't ever plan to. When I was 23, I worked part-time as a park ranger in northern Minnesota. The winters there were brutal, with snow-covered landscapes stretching for miles. My job was mostly uneventful, patrolling trails, assisting lost hikers, and keeping an eye on wildlife. But on December 15th, 2021, I experienced something I can't explain, and I don't think I ever will. It was a cold, cloudless night. The stars seemed to burn brighter against the black sky, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the snow. My shift was almost over when I got a call about a loud noise reported near the frozen lake in the northern section of the park. The lake wasn't a popular spot in winter, and the idea of someone out there at night made me uneasy. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, the snow crunching under my boots as I followed the trail to the lake. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling branches, no distant calls of wildlife. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. When I reached the lake, I saw nothing unusual at first. The surface was frozen solid, shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Then I noticed it, footprints leading out onto the ice. They were fresh, and they didn't belong to an animal. They were human. "Hello?" I called out, scanning the area with my flashlight. No response. Against my better judgment, I followed the footprints onto the ice. They led straight to the center of the lake, where they abruptly stopped. There were no signs of anyone falling through the ice, no cracks, no holes, nothing. I stood there, confused, my breath visible in the freezing air. That's when I heard it. A faint humming sound, low and rhythmic, rising from beneath the ice. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, vibrating through my boots. I crouched down and shone my flashlight on the ice. At first, I saw nothing but my own distorted reflection. But as the humming intensified, I noticed something moving beneath the surface, shadows, swirling and writhing. And then I saw it. A face. It pressed against the underside of the ice, pale and featureless, with hollow, gaping eyes and a mouth stretched into a soundless scream. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the ice seemed thinner, as if it were separating me from whatever was underneath by the barest fraction of an inch. I scrambled backward, slipping and falling onto the ice. The face disappeared, but the humming didn't stop. It grew louder, almost deafening, as more shapes began to appear beneath the surface, arms, hands, bodies. They were clawing at the ice, as if trying to break through. I don't remember how I made it back to the shore. All I know is that I ran, my heart pounding, the humming following me until I was back in the trees. The next morning, I reported what I'd seen to my supervisor. He laughed it off, saying I must have been tired or imagining things. But when we went back to the lake, the footprints were gone, and the ice was pristine. I quit that job a few months later, but I still think about that night. About the footprints that led to nowhere. About the face staring up at me from the depths. I've heard stories about lakes swallowing people whole, about spirits trapped beneath the ice, waiting for someone to notice them. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know this: if you ever find yourself alone by a frozen lake, and you hear a strange humming, don't stop. Run.